All right, welcome everyone. We are back. I'm back here with Dr. A.P. Canavan, and he has very kindly joined me. We are going to be discussing Gardens of the Moon by Stephen Erickson. This is book one of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And we are going to have a spoiler-free discussion first here. So if you haven't read Gardens of the Moon yet, you're perfectly fine to listen in for the first bit of our discussion. And we may divide that up. We may not. We'll just see how it flows. But we are definitely going to give you something to chew on. We want to tell you why we think this is one of the best, or maybe the best fantasy series of all time, and hopefully sell some new readers on it. And I'm sure some of the veteran readers will enjoy maybe what we have to say here about it as well. And yeah, there's just so much in Gardens of the Moon. Oh, and also I should mention that we are not going to be spoiling anything for future books in the series. And if you missed the introduction video that I did with AP a week back, basically I mentioned there that we're going to be doing one book a month. So we're doing Gardens of the Moon today. And in about a month or so, we'll be moving on to Dead House Gates. And then a month from there, we'll do Memories of Ice. And so each of the 10 books over the next 10 months. So this is our project. This is our series we're doing. And so today is Gardens of the Moon. And I have to say, you know, as an educator, I've often found that the best questions are more important than the right answers. And for me, Gardens of the Moon raises so many interesting questions. And there's just so much to talk about in this book. So we're going to start by basically just talking about some of the big things that stuck out to us on this is my first reread of the series. And AP is technically, this is your first reread, but not really something you explained earlier.
It's the first time doing this whole reread of the whole series. I have read bits and pieces of Gardens of the Moon a lot. But thank you for having me on the channel again.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to have you here. So what are some of the major things for really for everybody right now, people who haven't read the book before, but also the veterans, what are some of the major things that stuck out to you on this read?
Right. So I'm going to leave any of the spoiler stuff to, we'll do that chat later. But so in a non-spoilery fashion, the first thing I kind of wanted to talk about was in rereading this, I was struck by the fact that, you know, there's this whole myth about Gardens of the Moon being a difficult book, being a hard book, or that the Malazan, it's complex and dense. And we have, I think there are a couple of different factors that play into this, because rereading it now, it is very, very clear to me that no, it is not difficult.
Right.
And I think it has more to do with the terminology we use to describe things like this. So when we describe Erickson's writing as dense, what we mean is that it is very rich in information. So it's information that as you're reading along, you go, wow, there's loads of stuff here. Am I getting everything? And the big thing I found about Gardens of the Moon is you're not going to catch everything, but you still get on your first read, on any read, you get more than enough to understand everything that's going on. It's not hard. It's not complex. What we mean by, what I think a lot of people mean by it's complex, is that on a reread, there's even more that you pick up on.
Yes. Oh, for sure. Yeah, I found that to be the case for me. And also a lot more, well, of course, you pick up on some of the foreshadowing. It's rich in foreshadowing. And you pick up on, you're not as lost, obviously. It's far more relaxing, and I feel so immersed in this the second time. It's just really, I mean, it was just, I loved it the first time, but this time I'm absolutely going gaga about it. It's just a fantastic, I didn't want to do anything else but read this book. So it was just.
And I think this ties into like another aspect of why people initially find it difficult. And part of it is what our expectations are as readers.
Yeah.
In reading fantasy, for better or worse, we've become very, very used to fantasy stories that have a central protagonist or a very limited number of protagonists.
Agreed.
And they proceed from A to B to C in a relatively linear fashion.
The hero's journey, so to speak. Yes.
You know, we could go with Campbell's Hero's Journey. We can look at Propp's Morphology of Folktale, or any of the works sort of built on that.
Yeah.
But what Erikson has done in Gardens of the Moon is, if you think of that sort of narrative framework of the A to B to C in the linear progression, where the small event leads to a big event. So take Wheel of Time, the journey of Rand al'Thor. He
Yeah.
goes from the young farm boy to the rest of the adventure. Not spoiling the Wheel of Time for anyone.
Nope.
The same with the Lord of the Rings. You have Frodo leaving the Shire and going on a world-shaping adventure. Those tie into that sort of almost particular view of history of the great man of history theory, where it's these singular individuals who have shaped history. And I think part of Erikson's background as an archaeologist and anthropologist, Cam's background as an archaeologist and anthropologist, they realize that that is a completely ridiculous and inaccurate way to look at history.
Yeah.
History is made up of all of these small elements that build together that retrospectively, looking back on, we go, wow, that's what happened.
So it's like the poem by Shelley called Ozymandias, right? I mean,
yeah.
Look on my works, you mighty and despair, King of Kings, all that. And it's basically a little pedestal with a pair of feet in this desert covered, right? So much for that.
So one of the things about this is, in reading this, if you think of the Malazan Book of the Fallen as the history of this world, yeah, and it is made up of genuine characters, genuine people interacting, and they don't understand their role in the whole thing. It is not explained to them that they are the chosen one and this is their quest. And I think because as fantasy readers, we have this expectation going in, when it's not like that, we go, but who's the main character?
Right.
Is he the main character? Is she the main character? We get bent out of shape, and we get sort of slightly worried because we don't know who the main character is.
Right. Because aren't we on some level too? Aren't we seeking some psychological satisfaction by identifying with this main character and feeling very special because I'm the one who saved the universe, or at least I identified with that character during this journey. And there's I guess some happy cathartic feeling about that, right? But that's not what's being offered here.
Yeah, but you see that in Star Wars, both the original trilogy and even the sequel trilogy with both Luke and Rey are pretty much ciphers where the audience member, the reader, the person experiencing the narrative is putting themselves in that position. And there's an element of almost a power fantasy, wish fulfillment about, I wish I could be that character, I wish I could be that cool. With Gardens of the Moon, Erikson has taken a step back from that. He's given us multiple points of view. And these points of view, and it's something we'll get into in the spoiler discussion.
Yeah.
But without any spoilers, just to reassure people, a lot of these points of view characters, we form an opinion of them. And then we see them from someone else's perspective. And we suddenly get a sense that the world is more complex.
Yeah.
That what is going on, every character has their own agenda, every character has their own bias, every character has their own history, and that is shaping their perception of reality. So for a reader who's unprepared for that approach in a narrative,
right,
this can seem very daunting.
Yes.
So I think it should reassure readers that if you go in expecting a straightforward linear narrative with a central protagonist, you are going to find Gardens of the Moon difficult. But that's not anything to do with the writing. It's because our frame of mind reading it is creating problems where there aren't any. And it's because we're looking for things that it was never intended to do. So I think that's one of the aspects about how this is written, that if you're in the right frame of mind going in, going, I am going to read this and I'm just going to follow along. Don't get worried that there's too much information. There's loads of information and there's always enough to supply you with understanding of what's going on.
Yeah.
this isn't a spoiler, it's referenced early on, but the magic system, can I mention the name of the magic system in a
Oh,
non-spoiler?
definitely the Warrens. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So like one of the things I know has crept up in conversation, people say, I don't understand Warrens. And you go, well, do you really understand how Sanderson's metal burning works in Mistborn? No, he gives you some basic rules about its function or its effect. You don't understand it. So
Right.
why do you need to understand exactly what a Warren is?
No.
You don't. You don't understand how Gandalf's magic works. We can still read that. You don't need everything explained. We have a desire to understand how everything works, and we have a desire for all of this knowledge, but we don't need it in order to enjoy the story. We just go, it's magic, it's called a Warren. Let's see where this goes.
Yeah. I actually don't have a desire. In my case, I prefer not to know because that preserves the sense of mystery and the wonder in the magical system. I want some mystery there. I don't want it to be too explained to me.
Yeah,
So
that's because you're weird.
yeah, that's true. That is true. Yeah, but yeah, and regarding the the amazing point you're making there about the narrative perspective, there's nothing wrong, I personally think, about the hero's journey and the more traditional type of narrative. It's just good to understand that's not what we're getting here. We're getting something that is, in a sense, I think, the more I read Erickson's writing, there's some authenticity to this that I really love. Authenticity, what is it authentic to? It's authentic to the human experience.
Yeah,
And yeah, go ahead.
and I think part of that it ties into the world building because Erickson and Nesselmont developed this world and really thought about it, really put it together. There's an element of the authenticity to the world. When you have an authenticity to a world and you've created that verisimilitude, then you have to apply. Well, if a historical event happens in this world, is it just one person? Well, no, they can be involved, but there will always be other people. Um, for example, the UK, to go back to World War II as an example, you go,
Yeah,
it's all Winston Churchill. And you go, well, was it? Was it? What about the generals? What about the soldiers? What about America? What about the French resistance? What about the commanders in the African campaign? What
yeah.
about what happened up in Scandinavia? What about the Eastern Front and the Russians? You know, it's bigger than Winston Churchill.
But look at the power of that narrative that says we need a hero to worship. It's a very seductive thing, isn't it? And so we tend to bend reality to fit these traditional patterns. And that is something that I think Stephen Erickson says, no, I'm not going to do that. Right. And that's probably, I think you're absolutely right. I have to agree with you. That's the source of a lot of readers coming to this expecting that traditional narrative and being kind of, wait, where's my hero here? Where's my Winston Churchill? You know?
And I think one of the other aspects that kind of crops up is um, readers of all different stripes have very different reasons for reading. You know, for instance, if I'm going down to the beach and I'm going to be, well, obviously not with my pale skin, but theoretically, if I was going to be lying by a pool in the sun and I went, I just want an easy book to read that it's just going to trip along and I don't have to think, you go, well, that's one type of reading. I am reading solely for enjoyment and I don't want to think about it, just something easy and breezy
Right.
or something very simple and straightforward.
Yeah.
Then there's other times when you go, I want to curl up with a really good book that's going to engage me, that's going to immerse me in this world, that's more about the whole experience of reading and an interesting story and posing interesting questions and not just a linear adventure. That is not to say that linear adventures are bad, but they're a different reading
Right.
experience.
Right.
And
They have different functions. And I think that they're both important.
yeah, and you know, if someone said to you about food, okay, you're gonna have a giant roast Sunday dinner, like the traditional roast Sunday dinner, but you're gonna have it at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Monday morning. You'd go, I'm not really in the mood for it then. I want a slightly different meal.
Yeah.
Everyone would understand that. But if you say, oh, well, I want to read this book because it's amazing, I really like it, you go, well, maybe that's because it's the breakfast of that, or the lunch of that, or the special occasion of that. There
Yeah.
are different types of books, different types of narratives that suit different occasions.
Yeah.
So I just think some people going into this thinking it's going to be uh, a straightforward read where, for instance, the Dresden Files. I love
Yeah.
the Dresden Files.
Yeah.
They are great, entertaining reads, and you can sit down and you can follow Harry on his adventures. Great. But I never sit down going, right, I need to clear time in my schedule for this.
Yeah.
You know, it's one that you can read a couple of chapters of and sit down and not really think about it. Not no disservice to Butcher's books. I enjoy them,
Right.
but they're a very different type of read.
Yeah.
And I
And
get
he
a different,
understands that. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and you get a different reading experience from it. So when we say this is entertaining, there are different forms of entertainment.
Yeah.
We go to the cinema to watch a Marvel movie with things exploding all over the screen. We
Yeah.
can also go to the cinema to watch Citizen Kane and
Yeah.
go, did that entertain you? Well, it was Citizen Kane. There's different levels of what entertain means, depending on context, depending on what your preferences are. So that's in rereading this. I was thinking a lot about expectations when readers go into it and
Yeah.
why sometimes people find it difficult or why they don't engage with it. And I think those are some of those things that I just talked about are part of the reason for that. So again, my advice is read the book. You don't need to know everything. Just read, see what's there, follow along. Don't try to force it in your head
Yeah.
into the narrative you are expecting.
Yes.
Allow it to show you its narrative.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. That's wonderful. It does make sense. Did you want to talk at all about the poems and the structure, or save that for the spoiler part?
Well, one of the things I suppose we could point out, particularly for people who maybe have found themselves getting a little lost or not quite following along, a good signpost. And I don't know if I'm the only person who's ever done this. The first time I read Tolkien and I saw one of those poems and I skipped one of those poems.
Oh,
I said the first time.
okay.
Diana Wynne Jones wrote a brilliant parody book called The Tough Guide to Fantasyland, where she talks about Fantasyland trademark and about these gnomic utterances, this gibberish as epigraphs or poems that are just inserted at the start of every chapter because authors just do this.
Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. But Erikson uses that information. So if we think of the main text as the diegesis, the diegetic reality,
Right.
then these things are extra diegetic. They're from the diegesis, but they're outside of that narrative level. These things provide, if you spend time reading them and are familiar with how to just read poetry and understand poetry, they provide keys to unlock every chapter. They are guides to what's happening in the chapter. And quite often you'll read the chapter, and if you go back and look at the poem, you go, how could I not have realized that the poem was telling me that that was going to happen?
Yeah.
So it's a wonderful thing to pick up on when you're reading.
Oh, that's fun. And I personally love poetry, and I'm a weirdo again. I love poems in fantasy books. So I love the fact that he has, and I think they add depth to this world as well. The fact that there are manuscripts that are thousands of years old and that they have some relationship to the story of the present. I just love those kinds of layers that Erikson has added in here. And it's part of that world building that you mentioned earlier. This is just you can tell this was a world that was created over a process of years involving Erikson and Ian Esselmont. And it's just fantastic that I love the poems. So I don't skip them. I don't always get them right away. So I have to go back and look, and see, oh, that's what that was talking about. But they are a wonderful little, so don't skip the poems, people, right? I mean, yeah.
don't always skip them.
Right. Don't always skip them. Yeah. Maybe on your second or third read, you can look at them more closely. But
well, Philip, so what did you think on this reread? What did you think sort of in a non-spoilery fashion?
Yes. We're sticking with non-spoilers here. I'll tell you one thing that really stuck out to me this time. And I'm of course, when you're talking about the Malazan Book of the Fallen, you're going to talk about compassion. That's a theme that many people have discussed, that Stephen Erikson has discussed it at length in various places. But I'll tell you, in the context of what I read in this book, I think it's the easiest thing for me to do is to relate to you a short story by another author that I love, Ursula Le Guin. This story is called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. And just bear with me for a moment, because this does have a relationship to what I think is a central theme to the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And of course, we see this theme really being set up in Gardens of the Moon. So The Ones That Walk Away from Omelas is told by a very unusual narrator who directly addresses the reader and says to the reader, there's this city called Omelas, and it's perfect. It's paradise. It's wonderful. And the narrator directly tells the reader, if you want to have, this kind of architecture here, or you want to have pain-free, addiction-free drugs, you can have it. You can, if you want orgies, whatever. This is in other words, what the narrator does is involves the reader in the construction of this paradise called Omelas. So it's a very interesting, different approach, narratologically speaking, something you would be into. So it proceeds for a while, and you get to this feeling that, okay, this sounds pretty good, right? But then there's this aha moment when the narrator, I'm skipping a lot, but there's this big reveal, because you can't have any place that's entirely pain-free. You can't have a place without suffering, can you? That's just not real. So there is suffering and there is pain in Omelas, but it is concentrated on one individual, and that is a child. Sorry, this is a spoiler if you haven't read the story. I'm spoiling the story, but it's worth it, trust me.
Too late.
Too late. Sorry, everyone. But there's a child who is kept in this tiny room, and it can't even talk because it was put there when it was very, very little and innocent. And it is abused, neglected, isolated. It is living in its own feces. It is absolutely wretched. And there is a time in every person's life in this city when they must go see this secret. They take them to the room to see the child. It's right about the point of, adolescence, when you're growing up. It's your point of maturity. So you go and you see there's the child. And this is the reason why Omelas can exist, because all the pain and the suffering have been put onto this one individual. And I don't know how it works. It's magic, whatever. But that's how it works. That's why Omelas is a paradise. So it's a very disturbing notion. And when I teach this story to my students and we start discussing it, there's a certain point where I ask everyone, so do you want to live in Omelas? Would you want to live there? And the vast majority, in other words, almost everyone, except usually maybe one or two kind of cynical or clever students, will say, no, that's terrible. That's just an awful thing. And then that clever or cynical student, at some point, and maybe I have to push a little bit of prod and say, are you sure you don't want to live in this nice, everything's perfect. You're just, this one poor kid, sucks to be her or him, but everybody else is happy. Why not? And at a certain point, somebody realizes, wait a second, we already do live in Omelas. This is about us. And we get into this discussion usually about how we live in a world where our lifestyles depend on not just the exploitation of one child, but on millions of children and people around the world. And you can talk about, the shirt on your back. You can talk about the food you buy at the grocery store. You can talk about what's in your cell phone, and on and on and on. It's a world of exploitation, and there are wars fought. We've fought wars. The United States of America has invaded countries over something like the price of bananas. I kid you not. It's a world where some brutal things have happened, and we live in this web, right? And I see my students talking about this, and there's a certain point where there's initially, when they realize that this is a mirror, this story is a mirror, there's this kind of, oh, wait a second. Oh, And then there's this almost despair that I see when you realize how caught up in these networks of power you are. There can be this sense of helplessness, this sense of, I can't do anything. I'm just one person. I'm this cog in this wheel that's really just part of this vast machine. And this is something I see a lot in Gardens of the Moon. This is where I'm going to bring it around here to the Malazan Book of the Fallen. You see this in the characters, this sense of despair. An empire is a terrible thing. It is built on exploitation. It's built on blood. It's built on conquest. It is this voracious beast. I forget the exact term, but early on in Gardens of the Moon, Erikson describes the Malazan Empire. These are not the good guys here, okay? Even though we love these characters, you know, Go, Whiskey Jack, and they're working for this empire that has killed a lot of people and hurt a lot of people. But there's this sense when you're part of this big, vast thing that you can't do anything about it. You just have to do your little job within this vast network. And there's just not much you can do. We're at the mercy of these huge institutions and social forces. And as Riga says in the beginning, it's prod and pull, right? The empire is going to do its thing. And it's like this relentless machine. If you're in the way, it's going to grind you up, right? And that's just how it is. And there's nothing you can do about it. And there's this sense of despair and helplessness. And you see this in quite a few characters. When we get into the spoilers, I really want to talk about it a little bit, but characters like Lorne and Paran and others, where they're keenly aware of being in this position of doing things they don't want to do, but they're part of this bigger machine. Now, what I see Erikson suggesting here, and it goes beyond, by the way, society. It may be in our very evolution, right? I mentioned to you, AP, before that I read this book a couple of years ago, very famous book called The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. And talk about despair. You know, you get through that book and you feel, I really have no free will whatsoever. You know, I shouldn't oversimplify though, because Dawkins does have a point in the book where he talks about the possibility of you know, compassion and that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, it's just, maybe it's in our biology, you know, biology is destiny, that sort of thing, that we are exploitative, that we're in a world of competition and so on and so forth. And that's just this terrible thing. And you feel very tiny up against all of that. And what is the answer to that? How do we assert some sense of meaning? And the answer is in that theme that people are always talking about, compassion. And I see it in the characters. I'm not going to give specifics here because we're still in the non-spoiler part of our discussion. But what you witness in these stories are some moments, and they're maybe small. You know, is this enough to save our society? Is this enough to save our species? I don't know. I don't think Erikson is giving that kind of answer here. But what I do see happening is in these acts of compassion, there is a kind of freedom for the individual character, the freedom from despair, where a character will say, screw it, I'm not going to do what I'm being told to do by the powers that be. I'm going to do what I feel is right here. And it's spontaneous sometimes. And there's these beautiful moments of connection that result. And there is, you know, in compassion, there is freedom from despair. And that is something that really resonated with me and I found so incredibly beautiful in here. And there are characters who make that decision. There are characters who come so close to making it and don't quite. And you know, some make the breakthrough and some don't, but there's this common feeling of being swallowed up in this big machine here. And so that really is something that struck me in a very powerful way as I was reading this. So
and to add to that, I think while you have this theme of compassion, it's almost the function or the way it is created, the tool that Erikson uses to create that feeling of compassion, that theme of compassion, is that quite often he uses a close third person focalization. So point of view character, usually you imagine the narrator almost writing on their shoulder.
Yeah.
Sometimes you get into their head, sometimes you don't, but
Yeah.
it's a close third person focalization. So you're with a point of view character and they see one of the other characters, and they give the reader their impression of that character, what they read meaning into what the other character is doing. Now, what Erikson, I think, very cleverly does, and how it leads to all of this, is quite often he will have another chapter where the other person will be a point of view character. And
Yeah.
suddenly the reader is confronted with the initial impression they had of that character is not the whole story. And quite often
Yeah.
is demonstrably wrong. That
Yes.
the character that first viewed them was entirely wrong about them. And so Erikson uses the concept of empathy, of understanding other people and other people's perspectives, other people's lives, as a way to explain not only the big things that happen in the narrative, because this is an epic story with military and magic and all sorts of fun, adventure, and action.
Yeah.
But all of it is made up of these human moments and these human characters. And human characters are fallible, they make mistakes. Human characters are not always going to be paragons of virtue, nor does Erikson, I think, ever have someone who is like the antithesis of that, of someone who is evil just for evil's sake.
Right.
There's one character in this book who you may think that of, but in the spoiler section, we'll talk about it, but he's not evil for evil's sake. He's not a mustachio twirling villain who
Right.
just does it for kicks and giggles. So I think empathy is the twin to the compassion that runs throughout the entire series, to understand that it's not just good versus bad. It's not chaos versus order. It's not black versus white. It's the world is complicated and nuanced, and every person, every character, every situation has elements of good and bad, of black and white, of this. And so when reading it, one of the things that really struck me about it was how strong that element of encouraging empathy, of
Yeah.
encouraging the reader to think about their own lives. Christmas time is the perfect example of this. I don't know if anyone has gone out to try and do any Christmas shopping, but some people, their tempers are fraying. We've had a horrible year, and people are going to the shops and they're trying to get these things, and the queue is bad, and they end up they're losing their temper and they're snapping at people. And you want to take that step back and go, you know what, maybe they're having a bad day. Instead of getting angry at them, take a step back. The cashier who's being a bit slow input, don't shout at them. They're having a really rough day. Look at how busy that store is.
Yeah.
That these moments that in Erikson's book are in this fantasy world and dealing with these big things, these amazing action sequences and these world-shaping events are exactly the same in type, if not in scale, to what we experience in our own lives. And I think that's a wonderful point of connection that I got in reading this, that I hadn't noticed the very first time I read it, was how much this entire world depends on understanding that other people have their own interior lives, their own priorities,
Yeah.
and their own experiences that have led them to this moment.
Yeah. It's a beautiful thing. I love what you said about the complexity of the characters here, and how a character that you initially meet, and you're not in that character's head, you're in someone other character's head, and you have that character's impression of this character. And it might be that you think, oh, this is a terrible, like, I'll give an example without a spoiler here, but in Taishren, for example, and there's some, we'll talk about it perhaps, but it doesn't come off necessarily as the nicest guy here. But what Erikson does is he is capable, and I think this is a sign of a truly great writer. He is capable of taking a character, as you said, that you're convinced you know. And then later you get some other facet, or you learn something. Even you might learn something that was going on that explained what a character was doing in an earlier scene, and it totally changes your view of that character. And that is just such a wonderful thing that you don't find too often. There's a short list of authors who can really pull that off. And so I think that's a brilliant thing. The characters are complex, they're compelling, they feel authentic and real to me. This just part of the, you know, even though you don't get that traditional hero's journey type narrative, you love these characters. You identify with these characters when and as they appear. So I think
But
it's brilliant.
not only that, there are characters that you really want to hate, and
Yeah.
then Erikson reveals something to you, and you go, I can't hate that character now.
Yeah.
Now that I know what happened to them,
Yeah.
I don't excuse their behavior, but I can't hate them
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
they're human.
Yeah. It's like this guy I knew in high school. He was huge. He was like, you know, 6'5" or something. And he had already grown to that height when we were in like 8th grade. And he was a bully and he was a mean guy. And he probably almost broke my arm once. And, you know, and then years after high school, I was back in my hometown in Vermont visiting, and I saw this guy, and he was riding a motorcycle, and he was in leather, and I thought, oh God. And he saw me, and he was like, hey, Phil, you know, and he was like my best friend, you know, suddenly, and it was like, wait, did I know this guy really? And those kind of moments come all the time in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. So yeah, some just really great stuff there. So are we ready to move on to spoilers? Should we anything else for the non-spoiler section that we want to include?
There are a couple of things that we could add, but I don't think they'd add very much to the discussion, because really, I think we'd like to get into specific examples.
Yes.
So do you want to conclude this here, and then we'll pick back up again with a bit more of a spoilery discussion? Or do you want to give a synopsis of review about this book?
I think we could probably do the quick synopsis, I think, and then just segue right into the spoilers.